Hello, you've probably seen the shortened version of my conversation with Martin Brinkley, Vice Chancellor of the Diocese and a member of the Standing Committee, who has developed a set of guidelines and checklists for property and real estate transactions by congregations in the Diocese of North Carolina. Martin, thank you again.
Thank you again, Bishop.
Let's pick up where we sort of left off. We talked about the sort of the reasons for these guidelines, and we talked about the types of transactions that these guidelines apply to. And maybe if you would just restate what types of transactions need to be covered in these guidelines.
Yes. The guidelines apply to virtually any type of transaction in which an institution of our diocese, typically a parish or a mission, is doing something to alienate real or personal property from itself. Selling land, selling buildings, entering into loan transactions with banks that require liens on land or buildings, entering into loans that pledge more than 50% of the operating income of the parish in a given year. But anything that gives a third party, in essence, a cloud on the title of church property is fair game for these guidelines.
What kind of things would not be covered or would not need standing committee?
An example of a transaction that wouldn't need standing committee approval is a deed of property into a parish. If a parishioner wants to give land to a parish, that doesn't require standing committee approval. What would require standing committee approval, though, is if the vestry of the mission or parish wanted to then sell the land in order to realize cash. Another example of a transaction that wouldn't require standing committee approval is if a mission were to lease property to have church on Sunday. Leases of property, generally conveyances of property into a church institution, do not require standing committee approval. It's conveyances out that are going to implicate the standing committee.
I see. So if we were going to just rent the space to somebody to use on a Sunday afternoon,
if we were going to rent it to somebody else to use on a Sunday afternoon, that would require standing committee approval because we're giving something away to a third party. But if we are renting the property for ourselves, that doesn't require standing committee approval.
Okay. So the principle is sort of, to put it in layman's language, if I'm going to take away from the property by leasing it or selling it, or if I'm going to tie it up by letting it be collateral for a loan, I need to come to see you all.
Yeah, probably the best way I can put the whole principle in one sentence is church property has to be used for church purposes unless you've gotten consent.
Makes sense. Why don't you walk us through the guidelines and
Thank you.
Tell us what's there.
Delighted to. These guidelines have essentially three parts. The first is an introduction of sorts that describes the standing committee, how we function, how often our meetings occur, how we work procedurally, because we are aware that we are not particularly well known, particularly to lay people, I think, in the diocese. And so we thought it was good to give sort of a general introduction that would help the rank and file vestry member learn a little bit more about us and how we work. So that's the first section. The second section of the guidelines is broken into 5 parts, and it covers 5 typical, commonly recurring transactions that the standing committee is asked for its consent on a pretty regular basis. Those are, if I can remember them, sales of property, leases of property away from the parish or mission, certain kinds of conveyances of rights of way or easements. For example, when a utility comes in and asks for an easement or a right of way, those require standing committee approval. And then the other types are basically loan transactions, where the parish is borrowing money for some purpose from a bank and pledging its property as collateral for the repayment of that loan. So there are 5 in this second part 5 sections that describe each of those sorts of transactions, and each of those 5 is keyed to a checklist and a set of form resolutions that make up the third part of the guidelines.
Okay. So the vestry or whoever's doing it can follow the checklist, and they can use those resolutions. They can just cut and paste.
Cut and paste and modify. And there are bold and bracketed provisions for alternative language depending on your situation, and you can use those and discard the irrelevant points. We tried to make this as easy for the vestry clerk as we could.
There were also a glossary.
Yes, we wouldn't be lawyers if we didn't have defined terms on things, and some terms occurred so frequently that it was good to just define them, and so words like diocese and parish and so forth, church, it was useful to just use those in one way and to define them, and so we do have a short section on definitions.
What else do you want to make sure our wardens, vestry, and lay and clergy leaders of the diocese know about these guidelines?
Well, I think my fellow standing committee members would not be pleased with me if I didn't report that we would love to get requests for standing committee approval a little bit in advance of the standing committee meeting at which you'd like to receive the approval. We're asking in the guidelines for 14 days, to have everything in 14 days before the standing committee meeting. We've had some experiences of folks getting us materials literally an hour before the standing committee meeting, and that can be a little bit challenging for us to work through. We'll end up with questions, and the approval won't happen when you need it to happen. So if by getting it to us a couple of weeks early, we can get things ironed out and make the approval easy, that's good for everybody.
And typically, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but typically the standing committee hasn't met in January, and sometimes it doesn't meet in July.
That's right.
Typically. I mean, it can for emergency purposes. So
That's
when people
correct.
are planning, they need to keep that in mind as well.
That is correct. That is correct. We do like to give our approvals after a physical meeting of the standing committee. That is our tradition, is that we meet face to face to discuss everything. The question sometimes arises as to whether we will do telephone meetings or give our consent electronically, and that is not our preference. We like to act as a corporate body and have the benefit of each other's wisdom.
Martin, this is an extraordinary piece of work, and we thank you and the standing committee for it.
Well, it's a privilege to do it, and I'm honored to be with you.
Long ago, that great Anglican John Donne said in his poem, "No man is an island entire unto itself." Indeed, we are a church in which no congregation is an island. Each congregation is part of the whole, part of the diocese. We are one family, one church. We happen to be at 118 locations called parishes and missions. This is a tangible way in which we actually live that out. Thank you. And thank you, and God bless.